Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here this evening. I'm just going to open up with a quick introduction before we get started. So I know we're all excited to be here for this book talk with Dr. Kelly Kindscher. He's going to be talking about the revised and expanded edition of Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie. This event is held in partnership with Kansas Land Trust and Lawrence Bird Alliance. Q is here with Kansas Land Trust selling books in the back. Kelly has agreed for the proceeds to go to Kansas Land Trust, so be sure to pick up a book after the talk. And Kelly is going to stick around to sign copies as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly. So thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Turned red. Is that off? I hope so. All right. Well, it's delightful to be here, and what great weather. You know, I think we're all ready to go out and look at prairies or collect plants or garden. And of course, it's a little early, right? Although I had crocus in bloom today, you know. Not native species, but still warms my heart to see them. So I'm going to talk to you all about prairie plants and their uses for food and medicine by Native Americans. Mostly I'll talk about food tonight. And I've had a great privilege to work at KU for a long time. And I worked there as a conservation biologist, plant ecologist. But I've also had a delightful time working with the Kansas Land Trust, and this event is really to benefit them because my message tonight is twofold. In some ways, most importantly, myself learning about prairie plants has been a way to connect to this place and recognize that where we live is prairie country. In fact, about 85% of Douglas County was prairie pre-settlement. And then the second part, equally important, is that really I'm talking about plants that Native Americans have used and still use. And I want to honor that traditional knowledge. And I want to talk to you today about how we can engage that knowledge. And on both topics, really I want to share stories. And if my book and information is useful to you, it's because I hope that you learned some of these stories and can share them. Because where these two come together, if we can share stories about the value of plants, if we can make use of those plants, if those plants are native, I think it adds to conservation efforts. People who want to pick plants, eat plants, tend plants, will probably have a stronger voice for protecting prairies. So that's my intent tonight. Okay, so I like to start with a milkweed picture, because most people think of milkweeds now as pollinator food, or actually caterpillar food for monarch butterflies, right? That's kind of the big thing about them. Although many people grew up, myself included, knowing that milkweeds were poisonous, right? Raise hands. How many of you realize milkweeds are poisonous, right? And then many of us also, I grew up on a farm, recognize them as weeds. And they are called milkweeds, which is unfortunate, really. I'm very much into changing names of plants, common names, and I haven't got a good one yet for milkweeds, but I'm working on that. Especially when we have endangered milkweed, right? That's almost counterintuitive. Meets milkweed, really nice prairie plant. So I show this because I've had great opportunity to work with a lot of tribes, and colleagues and friends I worked with on the Potawatomi Reservation eat milkweeds. The Omaha eat milkweeds. The Winnebagos eat milkweeds. Most all of the regional Native people still eat milkweeds, besides having it as a long-term food culturally. And the parts that are edible are the little tender buds, not the pinkish one. The one up above it's still green, or the young shoots. And they make, honestly, they're one of the sweetest vegetables I know. As a green, they're actually sweet. So I encourage you to consider picking some and eating them. You need to cook them because they do have compounds in them. They have that milky sap, right? That's full of cardiac glycosides, which aren't helpful to us. That's why you need to cook them. My Potawatomi friends laughed at me when I was talking about boiling them and draining off the water and maybe doing that twice. It's like, no, just put them in soup and eat them. I think a lot of our fears of poisoning are overblown. Like, how many of you know someone's been poisoned by milkweed? And yet we tell everybody they're poisonous, right? Well, a colleague, an ethnobotany colleague of mine who worked with the Miami tribe, and he was at Miami University, so much like Kansas and Kansas University, there's connections there. They're still eating milkweed, and he did work with them in terms of harvest to figure out sustainable harvest and learned some very important things, doing chemistry work too. The chemistry work showed that the cardiac glycosides are much less potent or much less in amount in the younger tender shoots and in the shoots coming up. Kind of makes sense. Fresh material that's growing doesn't have as many secondary compounds. Plants create secondary compounds to defend themselves. So most of these poisonous principles are to stop yourself from being eaten. And of course, the way nature works is like the monarch butterfly larvae figured this out. And it's like they have a way to shunt the poisonous parts so it doesn't bother them, right? So anyway, the tender parts are good. You should still cook them because that reduces them to the degree that they're not poisonous, essentially, in this species and in the other common milkweed species in western Kansas. But the other milkweeds have greater amounts of those compounds. So cooking them really helps. Picking tender parts helps. And in the conservation thing, it'll experiment for those of us who want to see flowers and want to have more milkweeds. If you pick the young buds, they produce more. You know, many plants, those of us who grow flowers, right? Your zinnias, you deadhead them, you get more flowers. That's not an uncommon thing. So you can actually use some of these sustainably, and you still have lots of foliage for the monarch butterflies and others. One other thing I want to say at the start here, too, is I've been working a lot with tribes on their names for plants and making those better known. So we did a project with the Omaha tribe, and Omaha, Nebraska, of course, is named after them. And a sad thing about Omaha is there's essentially no signage that indicates that anywhere. But I got a contract with the National Park Service, which has its regional headquarters in Omaha, and that's also the Lewis and Clark Center. And they had planted a native garden quite a few years ago, and so working with the Omaha public school system in Macy, Nebraska, where the language is taught, and with a couple people there, we created signage for 40 native species of plants that included the native names for those plants. I can't pronounce that one easily, but I'll tell you some of the names of others. And one thing I've realized in working with native names, it's not just the tribes themselves that should use them, we should start to use them. If we want those languages to survive and to be spoken, we need to help with that. We shouldn't just say those people should keep their language. We need to incorporate that. We kind of pick up French names. We're kind of cool if you know some French words, right? We should look at native languages that way. So I'll say more about that in a minute. Okay, so my book's out. Real excited about this. The old edition, I wrote it 37 years ago. Did some research 40 years ago. Hard to believe, but as a student at KU, and I've got all my degrees at KU, I work at KU, kind of not supposed to work that way, but I had this love affair with plants, native plants. And so after my undergraduate degree in environmental studies, which I've circled around and I now teach in environmental studies, that's not supposed to happen either, but I learned about prairies in my undergraduate work and fell in love with plants so much that after my undergraduate work, I stayed around campus, a lot of time in the library, and wrote my first edition of Edible Wild Plants. So 2 years ago, I got a call from the University Press, who published both books, and the editor said, have you ever thought about doing a new edition? And I told her, no, not really. I'm pretty happy with what I wrote. You know, there's not a lot of new important edible plants that I missed. So I'm doing other things. I'm working on other projects. But I got thinking about it after that. About a month later, I called her back and said, well, you know, I've learned some things since way back when. And, well, there's some things I've looked at. There's some things I'd like to change. Language, like I used Indians throughout. Now I'd say Native Americans. There was interesting language. I had some nice quotes from Lewis and Clark and drew some artichokes. There's a quote I had in the book that the squaw, Sacagawea, was digging Jerusalem artichokes, and now we recognize the word squaw has other meanings aren't so good. It's best not to use that, and I didn't hurt the quote by moving that entry. It's just now Sacagawea was digging Jerusalem artichokes. And then there were a lot more species, actually, that were food that I had documentation for. Not any big new finds, but in some cases, additional species of wild onions that were used as food, or other minor food plants that I had documentation of. So all that came together for the new edition, and of course I put milkweed on the cover. Of course, it's all based on prairies. We have some really wonderful prairies. This is the Aikens Prairie. The Kansas Land Trust has a conservation easement. How many of you have been out there? Fantastic. It's southeast of town, 5 miles. It's open to the public. I will be leading a plant walk out there sometime this spring. It'll be up on the Kansas Land Trust website. Cutie, we haven't set a date. We set a date, did we? Okay. Okay. Anyway, I'll lead a walk out there. It's very rich. It's got over 200 species of plants on it, including Mead's milkweed. It's just gorgeous with prairie plants. So we're in the country of prairies, and of course, grasslands and prairies, the yellow in the global map, are all grasslands, not called prairies everywhere. Prairie is a French word for meadow. See, there I go, a little French word, yeah. Obviously, in this region, you can see the green is tall and mixed grass prairies, type of prairie we have here. Flint Hills, you know, are best example of that, and remaining portion of native prairie that's left. The greatest part is in the Flint Hills of Kansas, but in the lower right, most all of our land is cropland. So prairies are uncommon and rare. And of course, management of prairies. Originally, most fires that maintain prairies, help keep them open, help keep trees away, were set by Native Americans. We have pretty good documentation on that. And there were natural lightning set fires too. Native folks managed a lot, although like all people, they had kids that liked to play with fire, and I'm sure there were fires set when it was too windy and they got out of control. And there's even documentation of fires in western Kansas that burned into Nebraska from the Arkansas River to the Platte River. Because once fires got started, there wasn't much in the way, especially out west, and if you had big winds. One of our problems for prairie management today is all the brush and tree invasion. And I keep telling my friends, we just need to take advantage of one of these days when we have those 40 and 50 mile per hour winds out of the southwest when it's really dry, and we'll get a whole lot more prairie and liability. Anyway, joking about that. Here is one of my favorite plants, and I guess with this, you know, I have to apologize. We're having this talk at dinner time, and I didn't bring food. And you would think for a food talk, you know, at least you would bring food samples. If someone wants to ask, I have thoughts about what I would bring. So if we get the questions, you can ask that. This plant is really wonderful. Very few people know it. I'm now calling it hopnut. It's been called groundnut. Peanuts are also called groundnut. People don't know it as groundnut. And of course, it's what Topeka's named after. The Ka word for this plant is doe or toe. And it has similar names in Osage and other languages. And so Topeka is a good place to grow dough. Topeka. People in Topeka don't know that. Most people think it's about growing, we call them Irish potatoes. They're potatoes from the Andes, right? We call them Irish potatoes. Wow. Anyway, this root food is high in carbohydrates. It's a bean family plant. It's very abundant. It likes to grow in wet areas, wet prairie. Like this plant originally was abundant at like the Baker-Haskell Wetlands Complex. That's the habitat. In the Kansas River Valley, it was really, really thick. We have some early documentation of some of that. And it was plowed up, gotten rid of, or grazed out. Livestock love it. It was considered a great food for horses. There's lots of documentation of folks at Fort Leavenworth on military expedition with their horses that they were looking for called them sea vines to graze on. The plant makes lots of tubers, strings of tubers. One of the names is rosary plant. Looks like a rosary if you tie them all together. And you can see the carbohydrate in this picture, full of carbohydrates, but also being a bean family plant. It's very high in nitrogen and also has quite a bit of vitamin C. There's been a little work on trying to cultivate it, but they're slow growing, 2 or 3 years. Curiously, though, Japanese are now starting to cultivate it. They have a related species, so they're more interested in our native plants than we are. And it's also ornamental, has these pink flowers. I grow it out at the medicinal plant garden. And it's a curious plant. It doesn't make, some of the plants don't make any seed. They're seedless, essentially. They're just propagate themselves by tubers. So they were abundant in the river valleys, and if you try to dig them up, you miss some, and you're disturbing the ground, so you create a good space for them to grow more. Favorite plant of the Osage, and this slide, always people talk about, honoring where you're from and whose place you're from. We have multiple tribes whose place we're from. Kanza. This is the Osage's map of their home territory. This is on their webpage. We're in Osage territory. This is part of their collecting territory. I'll say more about that. I've been working on a project with the Osage. We're working on an ethnobotany book. They've funded a couple of us to work on that, of looking at their historical uses of plants, working with the language program to figure out, in some cases, the names for those. And a lot of that historical work I've been doing is based on this man, Melvin Gilmore, who wrote a book on edible plants in the prairies, but he, in what he called the upper Missouri River region. He grew up in Nebraska, and he early recognized that Native people had stories to tell about plants. And he recorded those. He worked with a lot of different tribes, but he also was a museum curator, and I think may have poisoned himself in part with the techniques of the day, where he used arsenic and other compounds to preserve feathers and leather. Unfortunately, he got Parkinson's disease and didn't end up publishing some of his work. And I did a lot of work with linguists. One of the linguists at KU, Bob Rankin, who's pretty well known for resurrecting the Ka or Kanza language. But he told me, hey, there's this manuscript material of Gilmore's on the Arikara tribe, which I'll talk about. The Arikara are in North Dakota now, but when Lewis and Clark came through, they were in South Dakota. And in 13 or 1400 AD, they were known as the Pawnee. So they lived in Kansas and Nebraska, and part of them moved north at that point in time. So they're part of the Pawnee, essentially. This is Melvin Gilmore's book. I really love history. So these are Melvin Gilmore's field notes. So Gilmore was kind of a misfit. He worked at the Nebraska Historical Society, and he got laid off. He was the first person to point out that Native Americans at Wounded Knee, it was not a fair battle, it was a massacre. He was the first one to document that. He is the first person to actually interview Lakota about the Battle of Wounded Knee. And that caused quite a ruckus because there was a cowboy and Indian film made by our government, the military department, to reenact that as a kind of cowboy and Indian movie, and he pointed out it was a massacre. That movie got destroyed, no longer shown. Quite the political situation in 1910 or 12. He lost his job soon after that. He went to North Dakota, and that's where he worked with the Historical Society there, and that's where he worked with the Arikara, and also some of the Lakota people up there. And then he got pushed out of that job and ended up working for the Hay Museum in New York City, which had a wealthy benefactor that was interested in more collecting than preserving culture, but some of both. And then the Hay Museum was a great place for him, where he continued to come out to Nebraska and North Dakota to work. But then the stock market crashed, and the Hay Museum had funding problems, and he got pushed out. He bounced around for a while and ended up at the University of Michigan and developed the first paleoethnobotany lab, of where archaeologists would take things they found in archaeological sites and say, what seeds are these? And he developed techniques at identifying those, just physical, looking at them physically under a microscope and those sorts of things. So ended up with papers all over the place. Hay Museum's now part of the Smithsonian because of the collection. So all of his Hay work went to Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I had the great pleasure of going to all of those places, museums, archives, and getting his notes. So I either photocopied or took pictures of about 5,000 pages of material, which serves kind of a backdrop for a lot of my work. And then we work with databases, so took that information and other information and incorporated it into the database. So when I'm writing this new edition of the book, I go to the database and look at all the sources and have to interpret those, because some of the information's biased, some of it's wrong, some of it has misidentifications, but most of it's really good and fascinating. Okay, let's talk a few plants, chokecherries. Okay, so when I talk about prairie plants, some of my colleagues at the university look askance, because I believe that trees, shrubs, and weeds are part of the prairie. And a lot of us have kind of a purist idea of prairie of just being, wildflowers with some grasses. Woody plants were part of the prairie. Plums, chokecherries, sumac, all those plants are part of the prairie. And our weeds, like lambsquoters, pigweeds, I said milkweeds. Those are all part of the prairie, too. Nompazinga is the Omaha name here for chokecherries. And chokecherries, how many are familiar with chokecherries? So they're a wild cherry. We have a wild cherry tree here, but the fruit's decent size, you can tell from my hand, but the pits are large. There's not a lot of good fruit on it. Traditionally, they were dried and cooked and pounded up, pit and all. Gilmore collected this chokecherry pounder. This is a Arikara chokecherry pounder. Took people quite a while probably to pound up the cherries. Also, it's fabulous, but Gilmore actually collected the chokecherry pats. And if you look carefully, you see little white flecks in them. That's the ground up pits. So I seen that, I was like, oh, they did grind that stuff pretty fine. This food tradition still continues. I've had wojapi, which is Lakota for essentially chokecherry soup. And so the chokecherries are pounded up when they're in the summertime and turned into soup, or you can use the dried pats and break them apart and make a soup. Thickened a little bit, probably originally with some sort of native grain flour or chokecherry, or prairie turnip flour, and sweetened a little bit. Makes a good soup, but it's gritty. Kind of like old-timey pears that have little cells in them that are gritty, a little bit like that. Okay, weeds. So this picture on the left of lambsquoters, all the tribes use lambsquoters. They're great greens. And I follow their pattern. Typically, when native folks are growing corn, beans, and squash, they would manage the weeds. And things like lambsquoters weren't just immediately pulled out. No, that was food too. And I do that in my garden. I let some lambsquoter plants go to seed. I have bunches of lambsquoters coming up, and I garden around and through them and weed them to eat them in part. Okay, so with the Gilmore material, I mentioned there's all this RCRA material, I ended up realizing that where we're at these days, I'm not going to write a book about the RCRA. I need to find RCRA colleagues to work with so that we can write a book, so there can be a RCRA book. I may have done the archival work, but I need their interpretation, I need help with the language. And working at KU, I've been associated with Indigenous Studies program for a long time, and one of the former faculty members there was Michael Yellowbird, who was a RCRA. And I knew that, remember that, so when I started getting this Gilmore material and there was a book-length amount of material, I got a hold of Michael and said, hey, would you like to collaborate on this? He said, yeah, I really would. And we should get my brother involved, Lauren. And Lauren worked for the National Park Service as an interpreter at the Knife Indian Village site, Knife River Indian Village site in North Dakota. And then Logan Sutton, the last author here, he's a linguist trained at University of Indiana and an expert in the RCRA language. So we could use Gilmore notes, which had RCRA names written in 1910, 1920 style, which needed to be updated. For those who work with plants, you know how names change on plants. Same is true with language and how it's characterized. Anyway, so we published this book, and it was really great. We ended up getting some donations and purchased copies for youth and elders on the Fort Berthold Reservation, where the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara now live. This map is to tell you we're also in Arikara country here too. This is a really fun map, and a talented student worked with me. This is a map of the gathering territory of the Arikara based on plants and based on what we know about gathering. So what you can see here is there's triangles. The triangles are archaeological sites. So we know that obviously where people lived, these are all village sites, that they would collect in area around them. So there's a circle there about 25 or 30 miles around each village site. And that's where you'd have your primary collecting, where you could go out to most of that territory in a day or maybe overnight. So you just had local gathering. And then the white square is the Fort Berthold Reservation where people live today. So we buffered all those with a really kind of hot spot of where they harvest. And then we looked at the plants. And we had about 120 species of plants that we had documentation for the Arikara using. And they used plants from the Rocky Mountains. They used some fir and spruce, and the closest place to all those village sites would be in Wyoming or Montana, where you hit the Rocky Mountains. The Arikara also used eastern woodland plants, and they would go into Minnesota to get to some nice forested areas to get those plants. And the Arikara also used Osage orange, or hedge trees, for bows. Favorite bow wood. As you know, it's extremely tough, strong, makes great bow wood. There's documentation they traded with the Osage. So they had to come all the way down here to get that material. The Osage were getting it from further south. Our hedge apple trees, actually that species is only native to the intersection of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana. It's been moved north and doesn't go too much further north here because it's not truly cold hardy. Anyways, this is the map of their territory. And of course, there were not hard boundaries between tribes. That's something more of us Western folks do, right? State boundaries, national boundaries. Prairie turnips. So they're one I've adopted. Gilmore said we ought to call them Tipson. And then the Lakota name's Tipsonla. Since no one knows prairie turnips, and they're not turnips. They're a root. They are in the prairie, but they're not turnips. I guess that looks a little like a brown-covered turnip. But they were probably between that and the Apios, but I think this was the most widely used, extensively gathered wild food by Native Americans across the prairie region. I might make a pitch, the groundnuts were almost as important, and I think before corn may have been the most important. But corn provided other resources. So the prairie turnips, you saw the one in the soil, were peeled. The extended taproot was braided, and you have these long strings of turnips. They can be used, pounded up to make a flour, thickener for soup. Oftentimes a bison stew would be thickened with this flour. I mentioned wojapi would be thickened with this flour. They're also boiled and eaten. They can be eaten fresh. They have a little bit of a raw peanut taste. Another bean family plant. A great story of several of the Plains tribes, but Omaha, Dakota, is that these plants are families, and they point to each other. And it's a little hard to see, but the leaves are shaped like my hand. And so when they would go out to harvest them, the mothers would tell their kids that these plants were families too, and they pointed to each other, and that the kids should go find the rest of the family members. And of course, there's a hide and seek thing for the kids. And the plants are a little hard to see. They kind of blend in with the green grass. But also the mom is using a digging stick, and the roots are in the ground. The prairie sod is hard to dig, so they're needing to, really go at it. You want the kids out of the way, so having them go hunt these plants is a good thing. So I've thought about this. Okay, do they really point to each other? Well, the plant is a tumbleweed. We have several tumbleweeds in the prairie. Our wild blue indigo, the wild indigos, and prairie turnips. In the summertime, the stalk dries, breaks off at the base, and they tumble away. And they're tumbling to scatter seeds. So for a tumbleweed to tumble away, you have to have a very, very strong wind, dry stem, and it finally breaks off and tumbles in a straight line. So it's possible that from the mother plant, those seeds have gone in a straight line from the plant and may scatter them in that line, and maybe they do point to each other. They're still used as food. This is a picture up in the Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota. When I started on this work, I knew I wanted to study medicinal plants, which I'm now reworking the medicinal plant book. Hang around for a couple of years, it'll be out. Takes a while, man. You think you learn writing over time, but I think what you learn is you need to edit more. But anyway, for working on medicinal plants, friends at Haskell, I said, hey, I want to work with a tribe that's been here a long time, and I thought, Lakota would probably be a good choice. So colleagues at Haskell told me of friends, and so I went up to Rosebud Reservation and made some connections. I ended up at Little Soldier Camp, just north of the town of Rosebud. Had several years where I made visits up there. And these are prairie turnip strings. People are still harvesting these plants. Grad student worked with me, Lisa Castle, is here in Lawrence now, works for me again, it's great. Did her dissertation on this, and we have what we call the prairie turnip paradox. The paradox is that we think the plant's pretty rare now because people don't eat it. It's one of these things where I encourage us to harvest plant material. You need to know something about plants and sustainability, right? You can easily imagine wiping out plants by taking too many, and this might be a prime example. You're literally digging up the root which kills the plant. In contrast to our wild echinacea, which you try to dig it up, you break off the long taproot, they'll resprout. But this one dies. But the traditional pattern, these things, again, grow in patches, maybe families, right? And to go dig them, you're disturbing the soil. And the traditional pattern is you dig them late, but before they blow away, before the tops blow away, you can't find them. So you harvest them when the seeds are ripe, when that top has ripe seeds. Traditional pattern is when you harvest, you also give thanks. You return an offering, which might be tobacco or cornmeal, but you also take the plant top and return it with the seeds to the disturbed soil. So you're actually planting seeds by harvesting, and you're making a disturbance. So we have documentation that go back to the same patches. In fact, a lot of the summer buffalo hunts, so the Kaw, Osage, Omaha, Ponca, all these plains tribes grew corn, beans, and squash, but in the summertime, they would hill up the corn and head out west to get bison. So there's pretty good documentation to return to the same places. And it's talk about the Omaha. that they would go on their summer buffalo hunts to where they could camp and harvest prairie turnips. They went to the prairie turnip patches, or they went and camped at the choke cherry patches so they could harvest choke cherries. The women would do that, take care of the kids, dry fruit, dry the roots. The men would go out bison hunting from there. You could never predict exactly where the bison were. They knew they were a little more common out west, but they'd send the men out to get the bison, but they would be at their prairie turnip patches or choke cherry patches. And they were returning to these. So we're pretty sure they were able to manage them, harvest them sustainably. And they went to places like this, Pawnee Buttes out in eastern Colorado. I can just imagine seeing a campsite out there, perhaps a little spring, a bunch of prairie turnips you're digging. Plums, my favorite fruit. Another important prairie plant. People don't recognize plums as prairie plants, but they are. These are plums from my family's farm in Nebraska. I love making my visits up there coinciding with plums. I love making plum sauce. Boil them down, pound them up. I use a food mill to get the pits out, and they can be abundant. There's more than one species of plum. This is what's called the sandhill plum. This is from out around Quivira and the sandhills out there. They can be very, very, very productive. If I'm out doing field work and those plums that's ripe, I'm stopping and picking plums. I also think about food as tea plants. I consider tea plants as food. If it's a medicinal tea, I call that medicine. But if it's a beverage tea, like bee balm, I consider that a food and a medicine. They're both. Strong tea, right? Very, very healthful. Washtima means fragrant leaves or strong smelling. This plant's important to many, many tribes, has both tea use, but also is viewed as providing lots of benefits. One of those, up on the Rosebud Reservation, this plant is used in the summer when you get those really nasty hot winds from the south, and it's hot and humid and everybody's irritable. That's when you take this plant dried and you make a smudge of it. You burn leaves, a little bundle of it, and burn it. What you do is you go to the south windows of the house, you open those up, and you put your little tray or pan or pot with the dried bee balm and ignite it, and that smell purifies the house. The fragrance gets rid of all the bad spirits. And I think there's something to this one, too. I think a lot about intentionality. You know, if it's irritable weather in the summertime, if you deliberately burn some incense, and it's good smelling incense, and you like it, it will change your mood, which will get rid of the bad spirits, right? Another one I like, too, the Omaha. This plant is considered a great pomade for men. That I don't know exactly the recipe for this, but men will make a material out of it, maybe a strong tea or something, I'm not quite sure, but put it in your hair, and it makes you irresistible to women. So I don't know. I need to learn that recipe. That's one of the tough things about ethnobotany and historical stuff, is there's not enough recipes. How did people, make this food or medicine or hair treatment? Easy plant to grow, really wonderful thing. I'm mentioning about the native names. Really pleased to say that we've gotten a nice contract from USDA. I don't know if any of you use the USDA plants database, but it's kind of the source for scientific names. They're funding us to work with tribes, tribal language programs. We're having some delays for a variety of reasons, including tribal language programs are funded by all sorts of entities. Money's a problem right now. We have some funding for them too, so it's moving slow, but the idea is to work with tribal language programs to get native names up on the database. So the way that will look is, this is how the web page looks, except we now are going to add an ethnobotany tab. And that ethnobotany tab will have, ideally, native name, translation, pronunciation, a sound clip, and an additional few sentences about the plant and its uses. Very excited about that, and we're just getting started, so hopefully we'll be able to continue this, and you'll hear about it in a couple of years. And bee balm's important Potawatomi. This is up in the Potawatomi Reservation. And Gilmore collected this, and so going back to Gilmore, one of the things I realized being able to look at his plant materials, he had collections, he didn't collect a lot, but he had good identification skills, so his plants are identified correctly, and there's cultural information. You can't read that, but it's talking about, it's written in Lakota, that is boiled, and the process of how it was used to make a strong tea, essentially. We have other mints here, Slender Mountain mint, pretty common mint in our prairies. Makes just a nice mint tea. Good for pollinators too. Michelin Jerusalem artichokes, Sacagawea. Jerusalem artichokes are thing, they're very aggressive in the garden. If you plant them in the garden, they may take over the garden. And they make big tubers. And the tubers are edible. Occasionally see these in the grocery store, sometimes farmer's market. They're crunchy, they're full of starches. They're considered a good food for diabetics because starch breaks down slowly. A lot of it's inulin, so you don't get that sugar rush from it. The downside of things breaking down slowly, it means they're somewhat indigestible. And so another common name for the plant is fartichokes. And I like telling that one of the translations, the Omaha name is it's called the food for homeless boys. And I don't know whether the boys eat the artichokes before or after they're homeless, but it could be either way. I've had a great opportunity to do a lot of work on medicinal plants. Like I said, I'll be writing about that. But we had funding collect 200 species of native plants and have the medicinal chemistry department at KU look for antioxidants, wound healing compounds, and anti-cancer compounds. And in doing that work, we collected lots of plant material, dried it, ground it, packaged it in bags for the medicinal chemists, and of those 200 species, the winner on the antioxidants, which I want to talk about here, was the ground cherry, or I like calling them now wild tomatillos, because now people know what tomatillos are, but the husk tomato. There's several species of them, but you'll recognize most of them look somewhat like this. Inside of that little husk is a berry that can be a ripe fruit, can be pretty tasty. But this plant had more antioxidants than oranges or anything else, really, really super high. There's a relationship between antioxidants and cancer. There's been work on vitamin C as a preventative for cancer. Results are a little mixed. And we had some really nice results on its anti-cancer properties, but it wasn't fully a winner. It actually reduced tumor cell size in rats. Looked like it was effective in the test tubes against breast cancer, but it didn't last. So this plant is full of antioxidants, which means that it's full of vitamins, very healthful, and of course it's used in making green sauce. There's the size of the fruit. In doing this work, we got excited because the fruits have a long history of being used as food, and well, that's great. You have an anti-cancer compound in food, whereas the rest of plants considered poisonous. You know, poisonous like we eat poisonous plants all the time, right? You eat tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant. Those plants are poisonous. But in all those, including tomatillos, the fruits don't have those compounds that are poisonous, or they're in very low amounts. Or as the fruits ripen, those compounds get weakened and changed. And you can think about this, well, a couple things. If I had you over for tomatoes and, for dinner, and then you got to sit down at the table and I boiled up tomato greens, right? you wouldn't want to eat them. You'd get sick. The poison compounds make you sick. You probably wouldn't die. So the foliage on most of these are poisonous, but we know that tomatoes are good, right? Yeah, especially if they're ripe. I mean, green tomatoes, anybody here fond of green tomatoes? Like, I know, fried green tomatoes, but you have to admit, green tomatoes, they're not really very good. They're kind of bitter, really. It's just, you know, gardeners have them in the fall. What do you do with all these tomatoes? It's going to freeze tonight, right? You pick a bunch. What do you do with them? There we go, pickles and relish. Okay. Anyway, so similarly, so we collected lots of these wild tomatillo fruits, and well, we put them in the lab because the chemists need dried plant material. They grind up dried plant material. They don't work with fresh material. They want dried material. So we had all these fruits sitting out. Couple, 3 weeks, they're still this like fruits, just, you know, soft, moist. A month, they're still just these fruits that haven't dried. They weren't even wrinkled. And then I noticed that they were changing color slightly, and this slide shows it better, but they were starting to turn yellow. And I tasted some, and they were getting sweet. They were getting ripe. So I didn't used to think that the wild tomatillos were very good. And I realize now I was eating green ones. It'd be much like, you know, growing tomatoes for your first time. And even though you're not thinking of relish or pickles, you're wanting to have that nice fruit. You don't know about tomatoes. You go out there because they got nice and big, and they're green, and you bite into one and go, why do people like tomatoes? I felt that way about wild tomatillos. But then we got the ripe ones. They're sweet. They're tasty. And they're full of great compounds. And then this is a simple map. The green areas where you can find wild tomatillos, entire country, right? They're weeds again. I like weeds, really. Got to change that name too, though. That's kind of denigrating. The stars show the states in which there's archaeological sites, multiple archaeological sites where you find wild tomatillo seeds. The numbers are tribes that use them for foods or medicine that we could document. And in Kansas, across the Midwest, archaeological sites, it's hard to find food in them because most of our sites are out in the open and plant material rots because it rains here a lot. In the Southwest, you have caves and dry sites. Things persist longer. But if things get burned, charred, and you get charcoal, then you can see them and recognize them. So they find lots of charred or charcoal that are tomatillo seeds at archaeological sites commonly. Now, you can't identify them as species. There are 70 species of wild tomatillos. There's like 30 some in the US, and they're confusing. But you can tell that you have wild tomatillos, and they're often found around the cooking areas. So we know that people are using them as food because many of us burn food. Who's burned food cooking it, right? It's a good thing. Archaeologists really approve of that, I'm sure. Okay, another puzzle for me, but this was at the Smithsonian. It's a Gilmore collection of wild tomatillo roots used as medicine for wounds by the Omaha. What's puzzling to me is Physalis lanceolata does not exist in the Midwest. It's only found in 2 states, in Carolinas essentially. So it's a misidentification. I'm really curious what it is. You know, modern technologies allow us to do things. Now we have DNA, and DNA, you can identify 2 species if there's been work on that group of plants. So for right now, Physalis has not had DNA work. But in working with the Smithsonian and with material like that, the Smithsonian would be willing to sacrifice a tiny piece, like less than 1% of what's there, to actually have it identified. So when DNA gets further along, we can do that. The Smithsonian, though, also now, more than in the past, honors tribal knowledge and honors tribal things. So this is an Omaha collection. You'd have to get permission from the Omaha, which I would do. I mean, I'd approach them and say, hey, we're doing this research, and we could do this and find out what species it is. And they'd probably say yes. The difficulty, though, with any tribe or tribal government is who do you ask permission? That gets a little hard. Tribal government, I guess. Tribal Historic Preservation Office, where I'd probably start. But think about it, it's kind of hard to get permission at the large scale. Kind of like asking Douglas County to do something. I mean, you go to a commissioner? Maybe they'd vote on it. But, but it's, the concept there is that we're now respecting tribal knowledge, and they might have reasons they wouldn't want that sampling done, and that would just need to be honored. Just have a few others here. Of course, prickly pears are edible. Tunas, the fruits, those ripe fruits taste really good if they don't have spines. Tastes a little bit like somewhere between strawberries, watermelon, they're full of seeds. But some really great traditional knowledge on this. They would, if you use tongs of some sort, hold them over a flame. The little spines, which are where the dots, kind of white dots are, they're the ones that get in your lip if you eat them. But you just melt them off. If you hold them over a flame, they just melt off. And there's no big spines on the fruits. They're good food. Wild onions, of course, Native people liked onions for flavoring, but I like what we're learning with the Osage. They are kind of skeptical. They didn't like wild onions. It gave them bad breath, you know? So like, I get that too. I show this too, something that's kind of exciting to me that I've learned about, but in the archaeological record now, we're finding that there was pit baking in the Great Plains. From Texas to southern Kansas, there are places where the pit baking technique was used. You may have know of this a little bit from like the Northwest where camas bulbs are pit baked, or from the Southwest where agave is pit baked, and you dig a big hole like from here to the blinders, 8-10 feet across, line it with rocks, build a big fire in it, get the rocks really hot with the coals, lay green material, grass or something on top of it, and then bring in bulbs. Wild onion bulbs, we have a camas or wild hyacinth species here that's abundant in wet sites. Other bulbs and tubers that are edible. And then you cover it up with more green material and soil, maybe build a fire on top, and let it bake for 3 days. And that baking turns those compounds, we talk about inulin, these materials that don't digest well, like onions don't digest well. It's the same thing. They have complex carbohydrates that don't break down well. But if you pit bake them, more of those large complex carbohydrates turn to sugar. So the bulbs get sweet and more edible and tasty. So there was a whole history of pit baking comes into our region. Okay, lastly, we do lots of prairie restoration work. I've done a lot. It's really fun. You get crews together. Courtney Masterson does this too. Collect seeds together. Get all these nice wildflowers. We don't tend to collect the plums, chokecherries, woody things. We don't tend to collect the weeds, which we should. But you get all these seeds, and then they're in bags, and then you get a drill, and you take this cornfield, and you plant all those seeds, and you get prairie. Maybe burn it a few times, have some weeds, and over time it resembles prairie. It's not real prairie, but it's reconstructed prairie. But when we do that, we're not thinking about edible medicinal plants enough. We're not planting lamb's quarters. We should be. We're not planting food plants. We're not planting medicine. We're not planting chokecherries and plums. We're afraid of woody material, that they're going to take over somehow. And, you know, if we plant those plants, I think we'll use these sites more. I think they won't just be, oh, this is restored prairie, and there's a sign that labels it, no one goes in there, right? I think we'll start using them. And some disturbance in those sites, good. And maybe you want a reason to burn. Like you don't want your plums spreading too much, but you want them to spread a little bit. You can start managing them for food and getting people involved, or for medicine, getting people, plant echinacea. Dig some, leave some, scatter seed, right? Traditional patterns. We've been growing a lot of plants at the Medicinal Plant Garden. Encourage you to go out. We also lead tours. There'll be a tour in the summer solstice. We've started doing this now. It's great because longest day of the year, you can actually watch the sunset because you're in the river valley north of town. Great fun. Put on your calendar. We'll be there. Okay, so my last pitch is we need to eat make pie, make jelly, tell stories about our native food plants. And then we need to tend, harvest, care for, get engaged with these plants. If we engage ourselves in these plants and plant materials, I think we'll make a better effort to have them in our lives, to protect habitats where they occur, to do a whole lot more prairie restoration, and I think it's good for us to connect. You know, with COVID, you know, we all had this burning desire to be outside more. We gardened a lot more. We grew a lot more plants. I think that's part of that connective process that we all want to do. And with that, I'll end here. Want you all to support the Kansas Land Trust in any way you can. Buy books tonight. There's Kansas Land Trust events coming up. Look at the website. Talk to Q in back. She's from the Kansas Land Trust. Thank you all. Questions? I'd take a few questions. Yeah.
Curious about if there's like medicinal compounds of invasive species.
Yeah.
There's specifically I'm thinking about honeysuckle. And I was just talking to somebody in the park the other day, and she was telling me about making jelly with the flowers and doing things.
Which plant?
Bush honeysuckle. A myrrh honeysuckle.
Yeah. It's not a great edible plant, but your target's right on. We need to look at invasive we manage by harvesting. In other parts of the country, St. John's wort, it's a bad pest problem. Well, that's great medicine. I just didn't look at this. Kudzu, which is on our noxious weed list, I mean, it has important roots that makes great starch, used as food. Sericea lespedeza, I don't know of much food use. It's livestock food. Is planted, you know, originally for forage for livestock and then as roadside stabilization. So not all of our noxious weeds can serve as food. Musk thistle stems surprisingly taste quite a bit like artichokes. You have to despine them.
What is it? Which one is it?
Like artichokes, the fruit, they're related in part. Cook them. But they're not a great substitute, don't get me wrong. But we need to think about, you know, what we can make use of with some of these. Who else? Yeah.
What's your favorite native plant?
I'm really fond of weeds. I mean, I really like lamb's quarters, in part because they're abundant. I can get them out of my garden for months. So they're abundant and common. I like that a lot. But then I would say plums. I like wild plum jelly. Kind of like, I can't beat it. That taste is primal for me. It's something as a childhood memory of picking plums. The smell of plum flowers in the spring. All those things, I mean, not. So it's those connections, I think, make plants favorites. And most of our wild greens, too, you know. A little butter and salt's a good thing, right? Your lamb's quarters, your milkweeds. A little fat is good. In fact, there's studies show you will assimilate more nutrients from foods, from greens, if there's a little fat. And it also reflects on traditional patterns. Southern cooking, right? Bacon fat with, you know, poke or other greens. Butter's great, right? Who doesn't like butter? I mean, you know, fat of some sort with greens and salt. We have an appreciation of salt. Yeah.
You mentioned wishing there were more recipes. You ever think about writing a cookbook?
I have, it's funny. One of the first articles I published was a lamb's quarter lasagna article in Janie Noss, you know Janie, in our Kansas cookbook. I had that proudly on my resume, and as I was finishing graduate school, I showed my resume to one of my faculty colleagues, and she went over and said, "You got to remove that recipe. That's just for a scientist. That's just not very professional." And I did remove it, but I've put it back. Yeah.
Are there things that are
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, things I've showed, bee balm, which flowers, pollinator, makes great tea. A lot of the tea plants be good that way. Lamb's quarter, manage your weeds. Amaranth greens, all those things are gonna, if you encourage them, will be around. Some are harder, some you need more quantity. To have much space doesn't make a lot of sense to have plums, right? I mean, and you need sunlight. A lot of these need sunlight, yeah.
Are there amaranth species that are native to the prairie, and do you know about the traditions of eating them?
Of amaranth species?
Yeah, amaranth.
I mean, I think around here, someone correct me, I think they're mainly just used as greens, and then the seeds are obviously food ground up. But I don't know, again, good recipes or even the cultural context for all that.
Do you know if they are native to the prairie or they are introduced?
We have both native and non-native species, and they're also confusing. But we do have a lot of native species of amaranths. Yeah.
Kate, I got here a little late, but I just wanted to make a comment and then a question. I just wanted to say that as a professional restoration ecologist, I appreciated that you were talking about the importance of weedy species, because that's what we're seeing in the science of restoring landscapes, is we're throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. Because not only are there as many edible weedy species, as long as they're not invasive in nature, the weedy species have a tendency, from what I've seen with research, to stabilize an area. Because you've got essentially a free cover crop that creates a more stable microclimate underneath there. So I just really appreciated that. And my question is, like, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on just the general lack of state and federal funding for restoration and medicinal and edible plants, and in addition to that, what are maybe some good actions that anyone interested in this could do to help push for more funding?
Yeah. Oh, I think federal funding is going to take a hit on a lot of these things. It's not going to fit the paradigm of funding, sadly. So I think it will take a hit. But I do think there's interest locally. I mean, I think there'd be ways to get, county money, perhaps for some restoration work. If it serves other benefits, again, wildlife habitat, soil erosion, CRP programs, those sort of things will probably continue. And I'm a big fan of guerrilla planting. You can adopt places and start scattering seeds, right? Look for places that are disturbed, that won't be disturbed a lot in the future. Scatter seeds, right? So there's that too. Yeah.
If you want to go out and forage for these things, are there places in the state where you can't do that and that's allowed? And I just want to know.
Yeah, very, very few, really. I mean, and we're kind of this place where prairies, we're trying to protect them. There's still the attitude mostly is like, oh, I mean, even with land trust, the signs up, Aikens Prairie. We don't want a bunch of people going out there digging it up. But part of that's because we're not planting, we're not thinking about traditional practices. Kind of related to this whole restoration concept. Melinda Adams, who's at KU, colleague of mine, is doing the cultural burns, which is like taking a different attitude to how we burn. It's not this forceful fighting nature fire. It's more ceremonial and encouraging nature to work with nature, right? And fire is natural. I think we need to approach restoration in that way, in that we want to work with it, kind of going back to Daniel's comment about the weeds. We want to work with these a little bit. So I'm very encouraging us thinking about restoration sites as being good places to harvest. And if we can create more of those, that's really where we should work and start. And I think we can do that a lot. I mean, even like on campus now, we have areas they've planted the native grass. Just grass, right? 4 or 5 species like the original CRPs, the Conservation Reserve Program land, when you see planted native grasses. Those are all ready for people to walk across and start scattering seed. Just saying, One more, yeah.
So elderberry,
Yes,
you can get that roadside pretty easily.
yes.
So that's one of the things, and wild plums too, you can often find on roadsides. So somebody told me recently that the raw fruit of elderberries are poisonous. Is that?
Some people react to them. You should cook them. There's some compounds that aren't great. So it's better, they're meant to be cooked.
Didn't know that.
You can eat some. I mean, it's like milkweeds again. You know, yeah, there's a few toxic compounds that survive even the cooking, but it's insignificant. But if you eat a big bowl of raw elderberries, you'll get sick. You're not going to kill yourself. Yeah, you probably throw up. They have that. That's a human body going, oh, that's not good, right? So, one last thing with that too. So a big problem with roadsides is there's lots of spraying. In working with the Omaha, Winnebago, and Nebraska, that was one of the big complaints we heard, is that we used to go get our milkweed and our plums, chokecherries off the roadsides, and the county governments, which are not the tribal governments, are spraying all the roadsides. So they're also in this dilemma of needing to develop places to go harvest and collect. Plus the spraying's killing off those very important species.
The railways are even worse.
The railways are worse, yeah. All of them. You gotta be, so if you're collecting things, be conscious of what the land management is. Don't want to eat pesticides, right? All right. Thank you very much. I'll be around. Hey, Doug. Yeah. How you doing?
Good. A few years ago, well, a long time ago, I read you could pull up tomatoes, the whole plant, and hang them upside down. There was a frost.
Yeah, and they will continue to ripen for a little while. For a while,
Like
yes.
in the basement or something?
Yeah.
I don't know, ripen in a week or two. Sometimes.
Yeah. It's a matter of when they're picked. It's kind of like, you know, any fruit. Peaches, you know, in the store, you know, they're rock hard. But they mostly are picking them late enough in maturity, they'll go ahead and ripe. And that's what you're talking about. If you get them late enough, they'll go ahead and ripen on the vine.
I was wondering if some of the physalis or something would
Yeah, they will.
ripen upside down on the vine.
Yes.
A little better, maybe.